Hello, my name is Graeme Barker. I'm the Emeritus Professor of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and I'm giving this talk with my colleague, Dr. Emma Pomeroy. We're talking about one of the major debates in human evolutionary studies, and that is to what extent, or how similar or how different were Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins, to us, the Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens, commonly referred to in archaeology as modern humans. And we're taking the opportunity to present new evidence from the project I'm running in Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan. Neanderthals were first recognized in the middle of the 19th century, and the find that gives them their name was from the Neander Valley in Germany. We now know that Neanderthals lived from the Atlantic Ocean right the way across to the Urals in Russia, and they spread south from Central Europe down to Southwest Asia, to modern countries of Israel and Shanidar Cave in Iraq. How old they are is much debated, but we can take 400,000 years ago as a reasonable starting date for when there were Neanderthals across this area. And they disappear about 40,000 years ago. Now, the history of our species is that we seem to develop in Africa. Homo sapiens then spread out of Africa between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, first of all into that area of Southwest Asia, and then by about 40,000, modern humans had spread right into the whole of Europe and right across Eurasia as far as Siberia and down to Australia. So by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals have disappeared and modern humans have become, from an African species, a global species, raising, of course, the big question about why Neanderthals, after so long of being so successful, failed. Questions that Emma will come back to at the end of the talk. Neanderthals had a bad press for a long time. When we think of that expression, nasty, brutish, and short, really that's the kind of image that we've had when you call somebody a Neanderthal, and that's the sort of, you're not referring to them as a refined person and so on. But actually, in recent decades, archaeology has given us a very different sort of image of Neanderthals. Evidence is debated, inevitably, but there is evidence that they buried their dead with funerary rites. Indeed, Shanidar Cave is critical for that debate. There's evidence that they cared for the sick. Shanidar Cave is relevant there. There's evidence that they used symbols. What you see here is a feather headdress that there's evidence for. And they made art, something that we thought only modern humans made when you think of the famous painted caves like Lascaux. Well, we now know that Neanderthals were making some kind of cave art tens of thousands of years before that. And the more we know about how they lived by hunting and fishing, we now know that they were able to do, and the hunting was complex and cooperative. So they're much more sophisticated species than was once thought. And ancient DNA now shows that they were interbreeding with modern humans, most likely in Southwest Asia, and most likely in that period, 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, when the two species were there in that region. And you see here two very, very different images, reconstructions of how Neanderthals might have looked compared with those images in the previous slide. And it's often said that if they were in the crowd today, you wouldn't really notice them. You'd see they were slightly stockier, but they're clearly very, very different from those 19th century images. Shanidar Cave is in the Zagros Mountains, the mountains that form the borders really between modern Iraq and Iran, form up in southeast Turkey. It's on the right up in the corner of Iraq, in the semi-autonomous region of Kurdistan. We can almost see the mountains of Turkey and of Iran from the cave. This is the cave today. It's a tourist site. And it's by the greater Zab River and the Zagros Mountains behind it. And you see here the view looking up from the river through this gap in the hills. The cave is up here. And this is looking from the cave down through that gap. The greater Zab Valley is down there. And this is in spring. And this gives you some sense of what it's like, extremely dry in the summer. And in winter, it's snow-covered. The hills certainly around it, snow-covered for a considerable time. The reason why the cave is iconic in Paleolithic, Old Stone Age archaeology is for the excavations by the American archaeologist Ralph Selecki in 1951 to 1960. Amazing excavations. He was looking for a deep human occupation sequence, and he certainly found it. He put a 14-meter trench down, working in Iraqi Kurdistan then, you can imagine, was really difficult in terms of infrastructure support and so on. He recruited a large number of local workmen, and they had enormous logistical problems excavating massive rock falls, and they got down to about 14 meters. He put a trench, a long trench, down the center of the cave. And the cave, I should say, was used by transhuman shepherds at the time, who would spend the winter months in and around the Shanidar area, the Greater Zab Valley. In the summer, they'd go up to the high Zagros Mountains. So there were people living in the cave when he was running his excavations. He found this deep sequence, and this is a schematic drawing that he made through the sequence. You can see he divided it into this 14 meters into 4 main cultural layers, A, B, C, and D. He was only able to date it. The only method was radiocarbon dating, and radiocarbon dating had a limit of about 40 to 45,000 years ago. That's the Ka. So he was able to date it kind of halfway down. And the rest of it, he had to estimate in terms of its age from ideas about the sedimentary processes. Now, what he found was an occupation of Middle Paleolithic culture. He gave the name Mousterian, which is the common name in Southwest Asia and Europe for material of this type. And above it was Upper Paleolithic material, and he gave it a local name after Barados Mountains. He called it the Baradostian. Now, in Europe and in Southwest Asia, the Middle Paleolithic is generally associated with Neanderthals, and the Upper Paleolithic with Homo sapiens. And indeed, in Shanidar, Selecki found a whole series of human remains of Neanderthals in these Middle Paleolithic layers. The Upper Paleolithic, he didn't find any human remains. He did find a cemetery much later at the top. But that's really the first reason why Shanidar has been so important, because it's one of the sites where we know that Neanderthals lived there, and then we think our own species lived there, raising questions, of course, for this big debate about why the Neanderthals disappeared. The main reason, though, I think Shanidar is so well known is for the Neanderthals that he found, because he found 10 of them, men, women, and children. And that's the largest group of Neanderthals found at any site. And he thought that some of them had died in rockfall. And indeed, there's a big split above the trench in the cave roof. And one imagines that in periods of cold, as now the huge rocks would come down. So he thought some had been buried by natural deaths, but some were true burials, meaning burials with funerary rites. And the famous one is known as the flower burial, because they were able to get pollen out of the sediment around the body, around the bones, and that was interpreted as indicating that the body had been buried with flowers brought in from the surrounding countryside. And the other aspect, which Shanidar is so famous, the Shanidar Neanderthals, is that one of the Neanderthals in particular was very badly injured in life and can't possibly have survived on his own, and died much later. So he must have been looked after by the community. I was invited to undertake a program of renewed excavations by the Kurdistan government in 2011, we were finally able to launch the project in 2014. In fact, the first year, 2014, we only were able to conduct trial work at the cave. And in the summer, when we intended to start real excavations, we then had to abandon the project because of the ISIS attack on the region, and Kurdistan in particular. But I did take the opportunity to go and visit Ralph Slecki and his wife, Rose. Ralph has sadly died now a few years ago in his early 100s. Because he had a large amount of the Shanidar archive at his home outside New York, as well as much of the archive is in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. And so an important part of our project has been working on that archive. Since his death, all his materials from his house now are in that Smithsonian archive. So we're trying to look at the old records as well as our new work. And what is happening is the old work is informing the new, and the new work is informing the old. And I should also say, when I was first invited by the Kurdistan government to think about re-excavating Shanidar, the first thing I did was to get hold of Ralph and in effect ask for his permission, ask for his blessing, and he was enormously supportive and say it was wonderful that we should be going back with all the modern methods of archaeological science that he didn't have then. So this is his trench. Remember, it was 14 meters deep in this particular area, what he called his deep sounding. And we concentrated the work on removing the backfill from what he called the eastern extension. The eastern extension is where he found most of the Neanderthals. So he found Shanidar number 1 here, Shanidar number 5, Shanidar number 4, the flowerberry, and others down here. This is a 1960 in the process of excavation. This is how the site looked when we began. We started emptying that backfill and exposing that eastern extension. By 2016, you can see we've got it pretty much exposed. And indeed, I put these ranging poles here in exactly the same positions to show this is where he found Shanidar 1, where he found Shanidar 5. And then in the following years, we've continued down. That's that eastern extension. And we've exposed a small part of his deep sounding. That's shown here. And then we've gone down. This is at the depth of the flower burial, where you see the figures here. That is, in fact, is Emma here, and where we found the new Neanderthal remains, the main new remains. In fact, we've gone down a little bit further in this part, where the sandbags now are. We've gone down another meter and a half, and we're down at about 85,000 years ago. And where we think we are is at this stalagmite layer that Slecki reports. So there's several meters still below that, which we'd like to explore. But as you can see, logistically, it'll be a very, very difficult task, because to try to make this trench much, much bigger and remove all this backfill is clearly going to be a big logistical task. These are the methods we've used. Having exposed his sections, his trench walls, we clean them up and record them to modern standards. And then we take lots of soil samples of different kinds from them, particularly for dating, charcoal for radiocarbon dating. We take soil samples for the method that's called OSL dating, which is what we're doing here, which has got a reach much older than radiocarbon dating. So this has enabled us to date those lower parts of the trench. We're taking a lot of samples also for any of the various indicators to tell us about climate and environment. So samples for pollen, and what we see here, this micromorphology block, that's where you can look at the soil in microscopic terms, and you can get all sorts of insights into climate and environment, and also human activity. We're taking samples from sediment, looking for ancient DNA, which is a new technique, in addition to looking for the more established technique of ancient DNA in the bones that we're finding. In terms of excavations, we've then cut small, what we call sample columns in the trench walls to collect bigger samples of soil. And then we're carrying out larger excavations in particular places. And all of this soil that we take from all of these processes is then washed. There's the cave up there. We wash the soil, and then we screen it, and we go through all the sorted residues and pick out every tiny fragment of animal bone, of tiny bits of stone tools, of tiny pieces of shell, of food that they were eating. And the idea, the object, is to collect everything, not to lose anything that is 2 meters in size or above. So it's very, very slow, very painstaking. Now I'm going to show you this diagram in several images. You can see that eastern extension, just to show you the broad framework in which Emma is then going to talk in particular about these Neanderthals down here. At the top, 20 to 12,000 years ago, this purple is it signifying rocks in the schematic section down. This is where these massive rocks are at the top of the sections. And we have no evidence that people are there. Now, in terms of global climates, this is a chart from global climate, what are called marine isotope stages, and broadly warm and humid is this side and cold and dry is this side. This is our modern climate over the last 10,000 years. Well, 20,000 years ago was the consistently coldest time that humans were on Earth. And it looks like at this period of maximum glacial conditions, it was just too marginal up in these Zagros mountains for people to come. So Neanderthals just were not visiting, we think. 45 to 33,000 years ago, we have ephemeral evidence for brief visits by the Barradostian or modern human, Homo sapiens, people who would have been living by hunting, fishing, and gathering. And you can see what we're finding are tiny little thin lenses of ash. That lens there is then excavated. We can see it here. That's 10 centimeters. So, and then cutting one of these morphological blocks through that, and that's the slide under the microscope. And what it shows is basically they're single-use campfires. And the vegetation in them shows it was at times of climate like today. So it looks like in such periods, small groups of Neanderthals were coming up and were using the cave as a temporary base. One thinks of days or weeks, hunting the animals around. The main animal now is ibex. And presumably they'd be there, they'd overnight, they'd have the campfire, they'd sit around resharpening their hunting equipment and so on. So very ephemeral evidence. Below them, we were looking here first at these bands. Below them, we've got down to the level where Selecki found Shanidar 1 and 5 and 3. And you can see the conditions under which he had to operate. He managed to encase entirely in a wooden frame and take the sediment out. So we haven't found anything there. And I never thought we would find new Neanderthal remains. I thought that all would have been removed. But in fact, over here, we have found articulated limbs, which Emma has shown quite clearly belong to Shanidar number 5, dating to around 55 to 50,000 years ago. And this is, again, debatable evidence about whether these are killed by rockfall or buried. Further down still, we have the Neanderthal occupation. This is all, remember, within that band D on his schematic section. What we have is there's evidence for Neanderthals using the cave to live in. Much of the evidence is much like that Barradostian evidence. These people here are excavating a hearth, and this is it through section. So just the same thing. It's a 30 centimeter ash layer. It's a barbecue. It's an overnight camp. We find those sorts of levels. Deeper down here, when we know the climate was warmer, more humid, consistently more like today, there is evidence that people were using the cave for longer periods. And it's amidst this evidence that we've also found Neanderthal remains at this level, and this is where the flowerberry was found, and we're right by it here, and this is how they first appeared. And this is what Emma's going to talk about in more detail. And then finally, we've just gone a little bit further down, as I explained earlier. We've gone about 1.5 meters lower down to that layer here. We think we're about that level, this stalagmite layer. We have the date down there from OSL of 85,000 years ago. And what we think these are, we know then the climate was fluctuating. These are phases of warmer climate. And what one suspects with this 85,000 here, we're getting back into the period known as MIS5, marine isotope stage 5, when the temperature extensively was pretty much like the modern climate today. So therefore, just to recap, what we have so far, this evidence of very ephemeral visits by our own species, going back to about 40,000, and then ephemeral visit, well, earlier than that, ephemeral visits by Neanderthals, and even more earlier, probably more consistent occupations of the cave, and then these phases of the Neanderthal bodies in there. So it's an ephemeral record and a very, very long record. And it's within that context that we have these new Neanderthals that Emma is going to talk about.
Thanks, Graeme. So, as Graeme mentioned, I'm Emma Pomeroy. I'm a lecturer here in the Department of Archaeology, and I'm the human bone specialist on the Shanidar Cave project. And after Graeme's overview of Shanidar Cave and its archaeology, I want us to take a step back again, just temporarily, to those bigger questions about how similar or different Neanderthals were in their behaviour from us. And as Graeme mentioned, one of the big areas of debate has been around whether or not Neanderthals buried their dead. Now, perhaps we shouldn't be talking about whether or not they buried their dead, but whether they conducted some kind of funerary treatment, by which we mean they treated the dead with some kind of symbolic or ritual activity. Because, in fact, if we look across modern human societies, we see that not all of those bury their dead. And although some do, like is common in modern Western society, many practice cremation, and there are a whole range of other practices, including sky burials, which were documented with native North American populations and still take place in Tibet, water burials, mummification, and even the reuse of human remains and bones for decorative purposes. But what unites all of these in modern human societies is that they have a symbolic component. And by looking at these behaviours, we can tell something about how that culture views the world, perhaps whether they have ideas about the afterlife. We can also argue that the treatment of the dead with some symbolism and ritual reflects a compassion for other members of society. Another thing that's often characterises human funerary behaviour is that we have special places in the landscape that are dedicated to the dead. And so from that, we can learn something about how people view the landscape in a perhaps symbolic and abstract way. And so that's what we're really interested in here, is looking at our evolutionary ancestors to try and understand when these capacities for symbolic thought and abstract ideas came about. So coming back to Shanidar, as Graeme mentioned, the Shanidar for flowerberry has been pretty central in some of these debates about whether Neanderthals buried their dead and whether this had a true funerary component. So here on the left, we can see the Shanidar for skeleton in situ. You can see the lower limbs here, the rib cage, and here are the arms and the head. And soil samples were taken from various points around the bones and analysed for pollen. And what was discovered was that there were clusters of pollen in these samples, indicating that whole flowers had been around the body. And these were various species, including the hollyhock, yarrow, and cornflower. And so the pollen specialists, Arlette Leroy-Goran, who did these analyses, and Ralph Selecki, both argued that this perhaps reflected a symbolic treatment of the dead body, and actually something we're very familiar with, placing flowers with the dead. And we can see a reconstruction of how this might have looked at the bottom of the slide here. Now, of course, proposing these kind of ideas in the 60s and 70s were quite controversial. And the debate around this evidence continued up until fairly recently. So some people argued that perhaps the pollen got there through modern contamination. Selecki himself recorded that some of his workmen liked to wear flowers in their belts when they came to work in the cave. And we know that there were whole families living in the cave and keeping their animals there too. So lots of scope for contamination. Another argument that's been suggested is that actually it was small burrowing rodents. So we've got a gerd shown here. and they're known to drag whole flowers down into their burrows. And there was evidence for some burrowing activity around the bones. So for many, they became skeptical of this idea of the flower burial. And we'll come back to that a little later. But there's another aspect of the Shanidar 4 burial that's less often discussed, but for us is also really significant. So Shanidar 4 was actually part of a cluster of individuals. The bones were really poorly preserved. So in 1960, when they were excavated, they decided to remove them en bloc. So move a whole block of soil containing the bones, take it down to the lab, and then excavate it there. So here you can see that block being transported, supported by wooden boards. And this was actually taken to Baghdad and excavated a few years later. Now, when they were preparing to remove this block, there were some additional bones which they noticed, which they were pretty sure couldn't be part of Shanidar 4. And on full excavation, they actually found the remains of 2 adult females, which were designated Shanidar 6 and 8, and also some of the bones of a young infant, which was designated as Shanidar 9. And this is quite remarkable and unparalleled elsewhere in Neanderthal archaeology, because within perhaps a metre by a metre by half a metre, we've got the remains of 4 individuals. Unfortunately, we can't really be sure whether they were all buried at the same time, or whether Neanderthals were coming back to this precise same spot in the cave to deposit their dead. By the time the block had been taken to Baghdad, some of the way strapped to the roof of the taxi, the bones were really quite displaced from their original positions. So, of course, in recent years, when we've been conducting new excavations at Shanidar Cave, we were very excited to identify new Neanderthal remains very close to that Shanidar 4 burial, because this provides an opportunity for us to reinvestigate some of these questions with the full force of modern archaeological science that just wasn't available to Ralph Selecki back in 1960. So here you can see a view of the excavations again, and here where our colleague Professor Chris Hunt is kneeling, he's looking there at the wall of Selecki's deep sounding trench at some Neanderthal bones in situ. These are shown here in this photo on the bottom right. So this area outlined with white contains a lot of darker patches, which hopefully you can just make out. And these are actually Neanderthal bones. And you can see quite clearly the alignment of a rib cage and also a clenched right hand up in the right-hand side here. And as I mentioned, these are in the wall of Ralph Selecki's original trench. What was particularly exciting is that we were able to use archive information to match this up to Selecki's excavations quite precisely. So this image here shows Ralph Selecki and T. Dale Stewart, the physical anthropologist on the project. And here we've got the Shanidar 4 skeleton still in situ. You can see that cutting out this block of soil to remove it. But just behind is this quite distinctive triangular stone and this kind of void amongst the stones. And in fact, this is that same triangular looking stone. So we can be very confident that these new remains were right next to the original Shanidar 4 burial. So we excavated down in plan on these remains, which took some time and involved various challenges because of large boulders and instability of the old section walls. But when we came down to the bones, we found, first of all, a very crushed but largely complete skull. So it's crushed to about 2 or 3 centimeters thick. You can see quite clearly here the lower jaw, the upper jaw just here in the teeth, the right eye socket, and then the outline of the skull here. Just below that, we had a really tightly flexed left wrist. So here's the wrist bones, the palm and fingers, and these are bones of the forearm. The 2 shoulders here and here, and the start of the ribs just here. So we've reconstructed that the individual was probably placed in position with the hand tightly tucked under the head, like this. Again, below those arm bones, we came across a very well preserved rib cage and spinal column. Now, everything ends along this line that I'm just indicating here. This is the edge of the wall of Selecki's trench, So basically, when that block containing Shanidar 4 was removed, they cut through this individual at the waist, not realizing at the time that the remains extended further into the wall of the section. So it's most likely then that the legs of this individual are in that block that was removed by Stalagmite, and that probably some of the bones currently attributed to Shanidar 6 or 8 actually belong to this individual. But because it's going to take us a while to figure that out, we've temporarily named this one Shanidar Z. As I mentioned, there's a whole range of techniques that we can now apply to give us insights into what happened to the body when it was deposited, and perhaps in the intervening period since. So one of these is more advanced dating techniques, as Graeme mentioned, and this hole here is where a sample has been removed for OSL dating, so optically stimulated luminescence. Another important technique that we've used is soil micromorphology, and we removed a block here that covered both the sediments containing the bones and the sediments directly underneath. This involves removing a whole block of sediment, as you can see in the photo at the bottom here. This isn't that particular one that we're talking about, but it gives you a feel. The block is removed whole, transported back to the lab, and then impregnated with a resin so that it can be very finely sliced and examined under the microscope to look at the microscopic structure of the sediment, because there's a lot that we can learn from this. So here is one of those slides from the block we removed here across Shanidar Z. You can see 2 ribs still in situ here, and you can see that there's a division here. So the soil around that contains the bones is much darker in colour than the soil underneath. What's more, our colleagues who are specialists in analysing soil micromorphology have been able to say that here, just below the sediment that contains the bones, we've got a zone of compression. So if you imagine you're digging a hole, as you scoop out the soil, you put pressure on the soil just underneath that and push it down. And we can see evidence of that here. So although during the excavation we were able to identify that this was probably a natural water channel originally, this evidence from the micromorphology shows us that it had been artificially dug even deeper just before the body was placed there. What's also very exciting is that in some of these voids just here, we've got evidence of mineralized plant remains, so ancient plant remains. Now, although we can't say for sure whether the pollen with Shanidar 4 was ancient or modern contamination, this does suggest at least that that pollen could have been ancient. And it gives us an exciting opportunity to look at these plant remains and potentially pollen that might be contained there, to see whether perhaps plants were used in the process of depositing the body of this individual. Another important question that I mentioned before with the cluster of individuals with Shanidar 4 is we weren't sure if they might have been buried at the same time or whether Neanderthals were coming back to that same spot in the cave repeatedly to deposit their dead. And that would be quite significant. It's really quite a big cave. So how would they know how to come back to that one precise spot? Now, in excavating the new remains, and you can see the skull in situ here, below the remains of Shanidar Z, there was a good few centimetres of sediment that didn't contain bones. But below that was some more partial remains that were partly in anatomical position still and partly disturbed. And we did find things like 1 or 2 teeth belonging to someone else that had made their way into the sediments around Shanidar Z. So this quite strongly suggests that there have been repeated burials on this same spot, and they come back to that same spot after a period of time to bury Shanidar Z. We don't at the moment know how long that was, so it could have been months, decades, centuries, thousands of years. It's very hard to tell at present. So if they're coming back to that same spot, how do they know to come back there? And perhaps what we see here is something, again, very familiar to us in terms of our own mortuary behaviour. the presence of markers of where the dead have been deposited. So looking at this photo on the left, you can see just along the right-hand edge here, this large vertical block. Now, this is a slab that's fallen from the geological fault in the roof and ended up vertical in the ground. The new Shanidar Z bones are just here, where I'm indicating, and this rock had fallen before all of these sediments accumulated. So it may well have acted as a natural marker for this spot in the cave. Also, this, what we've called the triangular stone, this one here, and that's the same one you can see here, although once it's cleaned up, it doesn't look so triangular. That may have been a marker too. It was right behind the head of Shanidar Z. It doesn't look particularly naturally shaped, and it's quite out of place. So although we've got big areas of rockfall, such as this coming across here, this is not in one of those areas of rockfall. So perhaps this is another marker of where the remains have been deposited. There's various lines of evidence that suggest the body had been treated with perhaps some kind of ritual or symbolic acts while they were deposited, perhaps fits with a broader pattern of evidence for compassion amongst Neanderthals. And again, we have other evidence from Shanidar Cave, which Graeme has already briefly mentioned, such as the Shanidar 1 individual. So he had suffered a severe injury to the left side of his head, and you can see a reconstruction of that here, which probably left him blind in that left eye, and may have contributed to the paralysis that we can see down the right side of his body. So here you've got his upper arm bones, the left and the right. You can see that the right is very withered. It's got evidence of breaks, and actually it was completely missing from just above the elbow. So he suffered some major accident that partly paralysed him and partly meant that he lost part of his limbs. He was also probably at least partially, if not completely deaf, walked with a limp, had quite severe arthritis. And yet we know he'd survived for decades with these physical challenges. So this suggests that he must have had some support and compassion from other members of his group. Of course, we also have some evidence of what we might consider the darker side of humanity, just as we do in modern humans. So again, looking at the Shanidar Cave evidence, Shanidar 3 has evidence of a puncture wound to its ribs. This was probably from a projectile and likely punctured the lung. But the individual did survive weeks or perhaps months following this, because you can see that the bone has grown up around the edge of that projectile, and you can see the clear groove here, and again, just here. Now, some have argued that projectile technology was unique to modern humans, so this must be evidence that there was an encounter, a violent encounter with modern humans, but some evidence also suggests that Neanderthals did have projectile technology too. And maybe it was just a hunting accident, we don't know, but possibly this suggests that darker side of interpersonal violence. We also have evidence from various sites, although not particularly from Shanidar Cave, of cannibalism, both in Neanderthals, but also actually in some early modern humans. So we can see cut marks on this thigh bone here, and evidence that it was broken while the bones were fairly fresh. This particular example comes from Goya Cave, but as I mentioned, we see similar evidence from other sites too. So, as in our own species, we can see perhaps evidence of a compassionate, kinder side to Neanderthals, as well as that darker and more difficult side. So in conclusion, we've looked at various evidence that suggests that Neanderthals were actually not so different from us after all. But if we accept that argument, then how do we explain why Neanderthals went extinct and we survived? Maybe there were actually some genuine differences. So perhaps Neanderthals were less flexible in their behaviour. Some people have argued this, and that the arrival of modern humans, or perhaps changes in climate, were too much for them to adapt to. Perhaps the arrival of modern humans brought new diseases, which Neanderthals just didn't have the immune sort of experience and the immune response to be able to deal with. And we can see in the pandemic situation today how a new disease can really wreak havoc, and if we didn't have modern healthcare, cause very large numbers of deaths. Or perhaps there's an element of luck or chance there as well. Perhaps Neanderthal populations were already declining because they were too thinly spread, and the arrival of modern humans just kind of helped push them over the edge. The Shanidar Cave evidence, though, is still really important here, because it does show that the way both Neanderthals and modern humans were using the cave on a sort of everyday basis was pretty similar. The occupations are fairly ephemeral, and there are hearths that are just, or fireplaces just used once or twice. And that's common in both Neanderthals and modern humans. We've perhaps got some evidence here of how Neanderthals used and thought about the landscape, potentially a special place where their dead were being deposited. We've also got evidence for things like compassion, care for the dead, but also violence. And we hope that with the advances in modern DNA analysis, we might be able to get some more evidence about the genetics of the Shanidar Cave Neanderthals. So we've got no ancient DNA from Neanderthals from this part of the world because it doesn't preserve so well. But if we could get that, that could give us some really novel insights into Neanderthal genetic variability and how Neanderthals and modern humans perhaps interbred. So just to finish up, of course, we need to say a big thank you to a number of people, especially the Kurdistan Regional Government and the General Director of Antiquities there. Of course, all of the Shanidar Cave team and our various funders. And if you have any questions, please do join us now for the live Q&A session.